I've discovered in organizing this event that the world is really divided into two kinds of people. There are people who don't remember Confederation of Tomorrow, and people who weren't around in 1967 and never really heard people talk about it afterwards. And there are people who do know about it and who were there or who learned about it afterwards or who knew or talked to people who were a part of it. And among that second group, without exception, when you mention Confederation of Tomorrow, their eyes light up, they get excited, and they're very pleased to hear that we're marking the anniversary. And I've had to ask myself a couple of times why. I mean, what is the big deal? It was a meeting of 9 premiers and 1 attorney general. We have those all the time. It also didn't accomplish anything in particular. It didn't lead to a new constitution. It didn't end with a declaration recognizing Quebec as a distinct nation within Confederation. It didn't end with a plan for Senate reform. It didn't talk about our obligation to live up to the treaties that we entered with Indigenous peoples across this land. So what on earth is the big deal? I wasn't there. I'm not a historian. Unlike Steve Parkin, I didn't interview everyone who worked on it. But in learning about the event, I think it did become clear to me what made it different and important. And those of you who've been following the writings that we've done in preparation for the event may have heard us talk about this. It comes down to, I think, 2 things, leadership and dialogue. In terms of leadership, what was noticeable about Confederation of Tomorrow is that Ontario as a province, and Prime Minister John Robarts in particular, had very little to gain from convening it in the short-term instrumental political sense. Ontario wasn't after anything in particular. It wasn't trying to get a better deal on Medicare funding, at least not at that conference. It wasn't trying to get an agreement about a particular proposal it had developed or was putting forward. It wasn't really trying to advance anything in particular that was in Ontario's self-interest. The province was acting because action was necessary in the best interest of the country as a whole. And that brings us to the second point, which is dialogue. As I understand it, a lot of people, including Lester Pearson, tried to talk Robarts out of holding the conference because it was risky. It was risky to invite Premier Daniel Johnson to come talk about how Quebec had changed and how it felt that the Federation needed to change too. It was risky to ask Ernest Manning to come talk about how little the prospect of constitutional change interested him. It was risky to invite Louis Robichaud to talk about how much his province looked to the federal government for leadership. And it was risky to do all of this live on TV for all Canadians to see rather than behind closed doors. But for John Robarts, as I understand it, the only thing riskier than doing all of those things was not doing it at all. Was not having a forum where all of those different and seemingly irreconcilable points of view could be aired. Was pretending that there was nothing really to talk about at all. And if he had used the language that we use today, he probably would have said, we have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. That's the only way forward. And 50 years later, I think we'll all agree that that is still the recipe for success in this country. In fact, if anything has changed, it's that there's a lot more to be uncomfortable about. The Quebec paper published this spring is absolutely right. It makes no sense in a country like Canada to think that certain topics like the Constitution should be taboo, should be off limits forever. We have to talk about it. And that's true, but it's also true that we cannot keep celebrating the fact that we have one of the most diverse populations in the world if we're not also prepared to have uncomfortable conversations about racism and about exclusion. And we cannot talk about reconciliation if we are not prepared to have uncomfortable conversations about the fact that reconciliation is not something that happens by publishing reports or by signing proclamations, but by changing how government works and changing outcomes. I could go on, but I think the point is clear. I think the reason that people get excited about Confederation of Tomorrow, the people who know about it, is that it was so genuine. It was so open-ended. It wasn't scripted. The outcome wasn't worked on by officials in advance and predetermined. It was risky. But it was driven by the fundamental belief that the only thing riskier for Canada is if we all stay comfortably at home and don't come to meetings like this and don't talk with each other at all. And it is in that spirit of not just openness to dialogue, but enthusiasm for it, that I invite Grand Chief Abram Benedict to come say some words of welcome to get this conference going. Grand Chief Abram Benedict is the Grand Chief of the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne. He was born and raised on Kewanoki, Cornwall Island his entire life, and he has previously served 3 terms as district chief for Keweenaw. His goals for his first term as Grand Chief include providing greater accountability and transparency mechanism, greater engagement with his community through social media to encourage instant community feedback, meaningful job creation, increased economic development, and relationship building. So ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, je vous présente Grand Chief Abram Benedict.
Good morning. Thank you, Andrew, for those nice welcoming words. Sego to all of you. I am, as Andrew mentioned, Grand Chief Abram Benedict. I do want to acknowledge the traditional territory in which we are on here today. I'd also like to thank Andrew and the Mowat Centre for inviting me this morning to give an opening welcoming address to all of you. I'd also like to acknowledge Andrew for acknowledging the territory in which we were on last night at the opening reception, so thank you for that. Also, it is from my understanding that 50 years ago, there was very little discussion at the Confederation of Tomorrow on Indigenous issues. I'm hopeful that by today's invitation to share welcoming words with you, that is a sign of good things to come. Past meetings of the Confederation have been conducted without Indigenous participation. We may recall First Nations, but it seems as though for a long time First Nations are considered second-class citizens in the Confederation. The inclusion of Indigenous voices as introductory remarks is a start, and I believe it is a sign that the tides are changing. I'm glad to see that the agenda today has a section on reconciliation with Indigenous people. I'm certain that the panel featuring former Chief White-Eye, Deputy Minister Richardson, and the Honourable Bob Ray will be an interesting discussion. The very nature of the Confederation leads to provincial jurisdictions often being exercised in silos and often entirely independent of one another. Having jurisdictional boundaries between provinces leaves Indigenous people in questionable positions. Provincial boundaries, like the international border between Canada and the United States, have placed artificial barriers that have fragmented our nations for years. Far too often, the struggle faced by Indigenous people are made worse by jurisdictional gray zones between the federal and provincial governments and their respective jurisdictions. My own community is a prime example of this. Akwesasne is not only split by the provinces of Ontario and Quebec, it is also split by United States and Canada. It is my understanding that the premiers will be here later today. I want to acknowledge them both for the work in which they are doing in reconciliation. Each premier oversees a very large jurisdiction area with unique history, legislation, regulation, economies, and priorities. As Grand Chief of the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne, we juggle 3 jurisdictions, learning the intricacies and nuances of each. Many chiefs and municipal mayors deal with only 1 premier. Our community has to deal with 2. The MCA has a political protocol between Her Majesty the Queen in the right of Canada and the Mohawks of Akwesasne in order to mitigate the areas of gray of jurisdiction. This protocol holds the terms of reference for a multi-jurisdictional table between Canada, Ontario, and Quebec and Akwesasne to deal with issues surrounding child welfare, professional accreditation, health, and the restoration of justice, to name a few. It is also meant to address legislative issues related to the management and regulation of lands, waters, roads, infrastructure, as an example. As well, there is legislation that has delegated powers to the provinces. Bill S2 would have put Canada and Quebec laws and regulations in adverse positions over a couple's property dispute in my community, should one of the couples have lived in Ontario or in Quebec. Our community has passed a law in accordance with the Federal Homes on Reserve and Matrimonial Interests Rights Act. Our community has also passed an Akwesasne court law. It is based on a community justice system that has been placed since 1970. All laws, like the couple's property law, will be heard in our community, a system that is culturally equipped to work with First Nations people for the best possible outcome. This is an example that provinces must cooperate with each other but also our court processes and voices of those Indigenous people that are caught between provincial legislation and policy. Ontario, in particular, has been proactive in working with our community to do studies of issue and to put in place tools to mitigate negative impacts and to provide the guidance on how to address current impacts until concrete solutions can be found. It is true that many responsibilities towards Indigenous people lie with the federal government. It is also true that the federal government has a fiduciary responsibility, but the responsibility for reconciliation is an equal responsibility of the province and indeed all Canadians. It is a sad reality that the plot of Indigenous people is often treated as a game of jurisdictional hot potato. We hope that our continued participation in these discussions will prevent this from being the case going forward. The Confederation of Tomorrow was held here as a pivotal moment in Canada in 1967. But this event today is still equally as pivotal moving forward. In the age of reconciliation, we must all ask ourselves how we are to move forward together. In the past 50 years, Indigenous rights have been recognized by the courts over and over and over again. These rights have since been enshrined in a constitution that lays the groundwork for this confederation. We have asserted treaty rights, hunting and fishing rights, and have started conversations about Aboriginal title and jurisdiction. We have also seen serious confrontations that occur when these rights are ignored. That is why it is now that is a crucial time to begin having those discussions of how Indigenous people will fit into the Confederation of Tomorrow. The aspiration of nationhood requires interprovincial cooperation, discussion, and inclusion of Indigenous people in all issues within federal statute. Few of our nations properly exist within the clearly defined provincial boundaries. Rebuilding them is by design a necessity, an interprovincial social and cultural construction project. I hope that our participation in this conference will help us better understand each other and as we move forward on this path together. I look forward to the next day and a half of discussions, as well as hearing more about the reports that come from this. On behalf of my community, as well as the Chiefs of Ontario, I thank you for the opportunity, and I wish you all well this morning. Nyao.